Step softly into a small Ontario kitchen in 1958, where the dishes are dried, the radio hums low, and a tired mother finds a stillness so complete it will make you forget the world outside ever existed. Come in and close the door behind you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest empty in your lap. If you're lying down already, good, stay there. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing here will ask anything of you except your attention, given gently, and let go of just as gently whenever sleep decides to take it. Before we begin, I'll ask you two small things, the way you might ask a guest settling into a chair by the fire. Where are you watching from tonight? Type it below, quietly, whenever you like. A country, a city, a kitchen table of your own. And what time is it for you right now? I like knowing that somewhere, someone is curled up at 2 in the afternoon, and somewhere else, someone is wide awake at 3 in the morning, and we are all, for these 2 hours, in the same small room together. If these long, slow journeys into the past feel like something you want more of, you're welcome to subscribe. Only if it's genuinely something you enjoy, nothing more than that, so that when the next one is ready, it finds you. Tonight, we are going to a kitchen. Not a famous kitchen. Not a kitchen that made history. A small ordinary kitchen in a small ordinary town in Ontario sometime in the late 1950s. The kind of town where the mill whistle tells you the hour better than any clock, where the sidewalks end 2 streets past the school, and where everybody's front porch light means something slightly different depending on whose porch it is. It is a little after 7 in the evening. Outside, the light has gone the particular blue-grey of a Canadian autumn dusk, the kind that seems to rise up out of the ground rather than fall down from the sky. Somewhere down the street, a dog barks twice and stops. A screen door claps shut, and in this kitchen, yellow linoleum floor, a curtain the colour of weak tea hanging over the sink window, a clock on the wall shaped like a sunburst. A woman is standing at the counter with a dish towel in her hand, and for the first time all day, nothing in the house requires her to move. You are her. For tonight, you have been on your feet since 6:20 this morning, when the alarm went off with its small brutal clang, and you swung your legs out of bed before your husband had even stirred, because someone has to get the stove going. Someone has to have the porridge on before the children are dressed. Someone has to be dressed herself, and pinned and presentable, before the day agrees to start. You have packed 2 lunches into 2 metal pails. You have ironed a shirt collar you didn't have time to iron properly. You have swept a floor that will need sweeping again by noon. You have stood in a grocery store deciding with real seriousness whether the ground beef at 39 cents a pound is worth it this week, or whether it should be liver again, because liver is cheap and the children complain. But complaining is not the same as going without, and now at last the plates are stacked and drying in the rack. The pot has been scoured. The tablecloth has been shaken out the back door into the darkening yard, and the kitchen, your kitchen, the room you have occupied for something close to 12 hours today, has gone quiet. You do not turn on a television because there is no television in this house. Perhaps there is 1-2 doors down in the Whitfield place. And on Sunday nights, the children sometimes disappear over there to watch something with their friends, coming home afterward, talking too fast about a program you didn't see and won't quite understand. But not here. Not yet. That is still a few years off for a house like yours, a wage like your husband's, a street like this one. Tonight, the only voices in this house are the ones that live here, and the low, steady murmur of a radio in the front room, turned down almost to a whisper because your husband likes it that way after supper, enough to hear, not enough to fill the silence entirely. You wonder, sometimes, whether that silence is a kind of poverty or a kind of luxury. You have not decided. You suspect it might be both at once, the way so many things in this house are both at once. The warmth of the stove and the cost of the coal that feeds it, the pride of a clean floor and the ache in your knees that made it clean, the comfort of your husband's chair creaking in the next room, and the fact that it is his chair, always his, in a way that no chair in this house has ever quite been yours. But that is a thought for later, if it comes at all. Right now in this exact moment, you are simply standing at the sink with a damp cloth in your hand, watching the last of the daylight drain out of the window over the yard, feeling the particular, hard-won stillness that comes only after a day has been fully spent. This is not the stillness of nothing to do. This is the stillness of a woman who has done quite literally everything there was to do, and has, for perhaps the only uninterrupted stretch of the entire day, permission, self-granted, quietly claimed, to simply stand still and feel her own weight settle back into her feet. You hang the dish towel on its hook by the stove. You smooth your apron once out of habit rather than need, and somewhere in the house a floorboard creaks under someone's sock feet, and a child's voice asks a small question from the next room, and you turn toward it, because that too is part of what this evening is, and part of what we are going to spend the next 2 hours inside of together. Not the loud, dramatic history of a nation. Just one kitchen. One evening, one woman learning, night after night, how to build a small pocket of peace out of very little, and, without ever quite naming it, teaching the whole house to be quiet enough to let her have it. The clearing of the table is the first ceremony of the evening, and like most ceremonies in this house, no one taught it to you outright. You simply absorbed it. From your own mother's kitchen, from the particular rhythm of 100 suppers watched from a high chair, and then a booster seat, and then eventually from standing exactly where you stand now, doing exactly what your hands are doing. Supper ends the moment your husband sets down his fork with a small definitive click against the plate. That sound is a signal, though no one would ever call it that aloud. It means the meal, as a shared event, is over, even if a child is still working through the last of their potatoes. You rise first, always, not because anyone asks you to, because rising first is simply what your body has learned to do the instant that fork touches china. You gather, that is the word your own mother used, and it fits. You gather the plates the way you might gather eggs, carefully one stacked into the next, careful of the good china edges even though this is not the good china. The good china lives behind glass in the front room and comes out perhaps 4 times a year for company, for Christmas, for the minister's visit. This is the everyday china cream-coloured, with a thin band of blue near the rim, bought as a set the year you were married. And you know without looking exactly how many pieces remain unchipped and which cup has the hairline crack. That means it must always go to whoever is least likely to notice. The oilcloth on the table is wiped in long strokes, always in the same direction, always finishing at the same corner nearest the window. Though you have never once thought about why you do it that way, crumbs are swept into your waiting palm and shaken into the small tin bin, kept for that purpose. The salt and pepper shakers, a wedding gift white with tiny painted violets chipped now at the base, are returned to their exact spot at the center of the table because a kitchen out of order feels, to you faintly, like a held breath that hasn't been let out. Your husband has already left the table. This, too, is simply how it is. He rises, folds his newspaper under one arm, and moves toward the front room and his chair the way water moves downhill. Without deliberation, without a decision being made, because for him, no decision needs to be made. The kitchen after supper has never once, in the whole of your marriage, been a place he lingers. It is understood in the particular unspoken grammar of this house that the kitchen belongs to you in a way that the front room belongs to him, and that this division was never announced or agreed to, it simply arrived, sometime in the early months of your marriage, the way frost arrives on a window. Not chosen, simply accumulated one quiet night at a time, until one morning you woke up and the whole pane was covered, and you could not remember the glass ever having been clear. The children, if they are still at the table, are told, gently, but without room for negotiation, to take their plates to the counter. This is not asked as a favour. It is one of perhaps 6 or 7 small chores that have been distributed among them since they were old enough to carry a plate without dropping it, part of a larger, unspoken curriculum you are running in this house that has no name and no textbook, but is in its way as deliberate as anything taught at the school 2 streets over. Your daughter dries. Your son, when he is home and not off somewhere with the Hendricks boy, is meant to take the scraps out to the bin, though he forgets more often than he remembers. And you have learned which battles are worth the fighting and which are not. You run the water hot. As hot as the tank will give you, which by 7 in the evening is not always very hot at all, since the tank has been drawn on all day for baths and washing and dishes already once this morning. And you work the bar of soap into a thin grey cloth until it produces enough lather to do the job. There is no dishwasher in this kitchen. Will not be one for years yet. If ever, in a house like this, there is only your hands, the water, the soap, and the particular ache that settles into your knuckles by this hour of the evening, an ache you have stopped noticing except in moments like this one, when your hands go still for a second, and you feel it arrive dull and familiar, like an old friend who visits every night at the same time. The plates go into the rack in a particular order, largest at the back, smallest at the front cups upside down so they won't collect dust before morning. And this too is a kind of language, a way of saying to tomorrow morning. You, here is where things are here, is how they were left here, is proof that last night someone took care of this room. It takes perhaps 20 minutes, start to finish. This clearing and washing and setting to rights. 20 minutes, that will happen again tomorrow. And the day after. And every day for years stretching forward in a line you do not examine too closely, because examining it too closely brings on a feeling you don't have a name for and don't particularly want one for. It is not despair. Exactly. It is something quieter and more resigned than despair. Something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a very long field you know you must walk across and simply beginning to walk, because there is no other way across a field except one foot after the other. But there is also this: by the time the last cup is set upside down in the rack, by the time the counter is wiped and the soap put back in its dish and the water let out of the basin with that particular gurgling sigh, the kitchen looks once again exactly as it did before supper ever began. Clean, ordered, waiting, and there is something in you, something small, something you would never say out loud to another living soul, not even to your own mother, who would understand it best of anyone, that takes a real and private satisfaction in that, in the fact that no matter how the day unravelled, no matter how tired your feet, no matter what small frictions passed between you and your husband over supper, or what mess your children tracked in from the yard, you can every single night restore this one room to order with your own 2 hands. It is not much. You know it is not much, set against the great sweep of a life, but it is yours, entirely yours, made and unmade, and remade every day by no one but you. And there are nights, this one among them, when that fact alone is enough to make the ache in your knuckles feel almost worth it. You dry your hands on the towel by the stove. You look once around the kitchen, the way a person might glance back at a room before turning off the light, checking without quite meaning to that everything is where it should be. And then, because the evening is not yet over, because there is still an hour or 2 of it left to be filled with whatever quiet thing this house does with its evenings, you turn toward the sounds coming from the rest of the house. The low mutter of the radio, a child's feet on the stairs, your husband's newspaper rustling in the next room, and you step out of the kitchen's brief private ceremony and back into the larger rhythm of the night. Without a television humming in the corner, a house like this one has to find other ways to fill its silences, and what you discover over years of evenings just like this one is that the house was never actually silent at all. It only sounded that way to you once, a long time ago, before you learned to listen properly. Now, standing in the front hallway with a stack of folded tea towels in your arms, you can hear the whole structure of the evening laid out in sound, the way a blind person might read a room with their fingertips. There is the low, steady tick of the mantel clock in the front room. Not a fine clock, nothing anyone would remark on, but reliable, wound every Sunday night by your husband's own hand. A small ritual he performs with more visible tenderness than he shows almost anything else in this house, as though winding the clock were a way of personally guaranteeing that time itself would keep behaving properly for another week. There is the radio turned low, carrying some evening program through from the front room. A dance orchestra tonight, something with strings, playing at a volume just loud enough to be a presence in the room and just quiet enough that it does not demand to be listened to. You could not, if pressed, name the song. You are not meant to name it. It is furniture music, room music, there to soften the edges of the silence rather than to be attended to directly. And there is a particular, specific pleasure in that, in sound that asks nothing of you. There is the furnace down in the cellar cycling on with its familiar, low shudder and a faint metallic tick-tick as the pipes begin to warm, a sound that in the depth of January becomes almost a form of company, proof that the house is fighting the cold on your behalf, even while you are doing something as ordinary as folding towels in the hallway. In summer this sound is absent, and you notice its absence the way you'd notice a missing tooth with your tongue, not painfully, just strangely, a gap where something used to be. There is the wind. Ontario wind in late autumn has a particular voice, and this house with its slightly ill-fitting storm windows and the loose board on the porch that your husband keeps meaning to fix and does not, translates that wind into a whole vocabulary of small sounds. A low moan at the corner of the eaves, a rattle in the kitchen window that you have learned to distinguish from every other rattle in the house, a soft continuous hush against the clapboard siding that tells you without you having to look that it has begun gently to rain. And there are the children. Upstairs, your daughter's feet cross the floor above the front room. You know without seeing that she's getting ready for bed, because you know the particular rhythm of her evening as well as you know your own name. The creak of the third stair, the scrape of the dresser drawer that sticks, the specific two-beat thump of shoes being kicked off rather than untied, because she has never in her life untied a shoe, when kicking would do. Somewhere further off your son's voice carries faintly through a wall talking to no one, or rather talking to an imaginary someone, narrating some private game involving, as far as you can tell from the fragments that reach you, cowboys and a train. You have become, without ever deciding to, an expert in the acoustic map of this house. You know that a certain creak on the stairs means someone is trying to sneak down for a glass of water after bedtime, and that a different creak 2 steps higher is simply the house settling and requires no response at all. You know the particular sigh the front door makes when it's opened by your husband, home from work, distinct from the lighter sound it makes when a neighbour knocks and lets themselves half in before you've even reached the hall. You know from 3 rooms away whether a dropped object upstairs was a book, a shoe, or, God forbid, something breakable, and you have learned to gauge purely by the silence or shriek that follows, whether you need to go up immediately or whether it can wait another minute until you've finished what you're doing. This is not a skill anyone taught you in any formal sense. No one sat you down and explained that a mother's ear becomes over years, a kind of instrument finely tuned to the specific frequencies of her own household. The difference between an ordinary thump and a thump that means someone is heard. The difference between contented mumbling and the particular register of a child working up toward tears. You simply grew into it the way you grew into knowing exactly how much flour a loaf of bread needs, without measuring. The way your hands learned a weight of a well-risen dough without your mind ever consciously studying the subject. It arrived the way most of a mother's knowledge arrives in a house like this, quietly, cumulatively, without ceremony, until one day you realize you have become fluent in a language nobody ever wrote down. There's a particular pleasure too in silences you recognize as good silences. The specific hush that falls when both children are finally actually asleep, rather than merely quiet and awake and plotting. The settled stillness of your husband's chair when you know by the particular slow rhythm of the newspaper pages turning that he has reached the part of the evening where his shoulders have finally come down from around his ears. You have learned to read contentment the same way you've learned to read trouble. By ear, by instinct, by 20 years of paying a kind of attention that never once gets acknowledged and never once in your own mind feels optional. Without the television's flicker and chatter to organize the evening around, this house's silence has texture. It has weather. On a stormy night, it presses close and makes the small fire in the front room feel like a genuine act of defiance against something large outside. On a mild spring evening, it opens up and thins out, and you find the windows cracked slightly. The outside sounds of the street, a car passing someone's dog, a screen door, 2 houses down, allowed to mingle in with the inside sounds until the boundary between the house and the world feels briefly almost permeable. You have wondered once or twice, half-formed and never spoken aloud, what it might be like to live in a house with that flickering blue light in the corner, filling every silence before it has a chance to say anything at all. You suspect, though you would never say this to Mrs. Whitfield, whose family got their set last spring and who has not stopped mentioning it since, that something might be lost in that. Not something you could easily name, but something. Because right now, standing in the hallway with your arms full of warm towels, listening to the furnace tick and the wind test the storm windows, and your daughter's feet cross the ceiling above you, you understand that this house is never truly silent. It only sounds that way to people who haven't yet learned to listen to it properly. And you have had, by now, a great many years of practice. Tuesday nights belong to the ironing board. It is set up in its usual place, angled just so between the stove and the pantry door, close enough to the heat that the iron itself never has far to travel back to its trivet, close enough to the radio in the front room that you can hear it through the doorway without the sound reaching all the way through to a real listen. You know this spot, the way you know the third stair or the sticking dresser drawer. It is simply where the board goes, has gone for as long as you've owned it, will go until the day you own a different kitchen entirely. The iron itself is heavy in a way that modern conveniences you suspect will never quite manage to replicate. A good 3 or 4 pounds of solid metal that must be heated properly, tested against a moistened fingertip with the particular quick touch you learned from your own mother, who learned it from hers. Too cool, and the shirt will come out limp and unconvincing. Too hot, and you will scorch a good collar, and a scorched collar on your husband's Sunday shirt is not merely an inconvenience. It is 39 cents worth of fabric, ruined by carelessness and carelessness in this house, in this town at this particular moment in your life, is not a luxury you can easily afford to display. You have learned the order of things without ever writing it down, collars first, while the iron is at its hottest and the fabric can take the heat best. Then cuffs, then the yoke across the shoulders, work from the inside where the seams lie, because a good presser never lets the iron travel directly over a seam on the outside where it might leave a shine. Then, the body of the shirt worked in sections, the board turned and the fabric shifted with a practiced economy of movement that would look to an outsider almost like a kind of dance, except that no one is watching, and it has never once occurred to you to think of it as anything but work. The starch is mixed fresh in a shallow dish beside the board, a thin white liquid that you sprinkle from your fingertips the way you might sprinkle holy water. Though you would never make that comparison aloud, not in this house. Not with your husband's mother's particular views on such things. The smell of it, faintly sweet, faintly like wet flour, mixes with the smell of hot cotton and the ever-present smell of the stove, and together they make up a scent so specifically tied to Tuesday evenings that decades from now, in a kitchen you cannot yet imagine, a smell almost like it will stop you cold in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and return you instantly and completely to this exact room. The rhythm of it is what you have come, almost against your own expectations, to value. Iron down, press, lift. Shift the fabric. Iron down, press, lift. There is no decision to be made in it, no small emergency to manage, no child's question to answer, no husband's mood to read and respond to. There is only the shirt and the iron and the particular satisfaction of watching a wrinkled thing become under your own 2 hands a smooth thing. Proof delivered fresh every Tuesday that you are capable of taking disorder and turning it methodically into order. You think sometimes, standing at this board with the heat of the stove at your back and the iron's small hiss rising up from the damp fabric, that this is close to what other women in magazines, women with different lives entirely, might call meditation, though you have never heard that particular word used for something as ordinary as ironing a week's worth of shirts. But there is something in the repetition that empties your mind out in a way almost nothing else in your day manages to do. Not sleep, exactly. Not rest in any way you could put your feet up and call rest, but a kind of stillness inside the motion, a place your thoughts can go quiet in even while your hands keep moving. It is here, at the ironing board, more than almost anywhere else in the house, that your mind wanders furthest from the immediate demands of the evening. You think about your sister in Belleville, whose letter arrived Thursday and still hasn't been answered. You think briefly and without much heat about the price of coal, which went up again this fall, and whether the budget will stretch to cover it alongside everything else without your having to say anything to your husband about it. Because raising the subject of money with him even now, after 11 years of marriage, still carries a small charge of something you'd rather avoid. Some old unspoken agreement that the household accounts are technically his domain to worry over, even though you are the one who actually watches every cent of the move. You think about your daughter, who is 9 now, and has started this past month, to ask questions you don't quite have ready answers for. About why she has to help with dishes, and her brother doesn't have to help nearly as much. About why Mrs. Much Whitfield's family has a television, and you don't. About things that, a year ago, she would never have thought to ask at all. You press a cuff flat and think that there is a version of this conversation coming sometime in the next year or two that you are not yet prepared to have. And you set the thought aside the way you'd set aside a shirt not yet needed. Folded, put away, but not forgotten. The pile of pressed shirts grows on the kitchen chair beside the board, each one folded with the same 3 motions, sleeves crossed behind, then folded up from the hem, that you learned as a girl and have performed so many thousands of times since that your hands could do it now in complete darkness. By the time the last shirt is done, the kitchen has gone properly warm from the iron and the stove together warm enough that you crack the window an inch despite the October chill outside, letting in a thin ribbon of cold night air that smells of wet leaves and wood smoke from somebody's chimney down the street. You unplug the iron and set it, still faintly warm, on its heel to cool. You fold the board and stand it back against the pantry wall, out of the way until next Tuesday calls it out again. And you look for a moment at the neat stack of finished shirts, collars, crisp creases, sharp cuffs turned just so, and feel that same private, unremarkable satisfaction you felt over the dishes an hour or 2 before, proof again made fresh by your own hands that some small corner of this world has been for 1 more week set properly to rights. It will all need doing again next Tuesday. You know this without resentment. The way you know the sun will rise tomorrow, whether or not you'd prefer an extra hour of dark. Some kinds of work are like weather. You do not fight them. You simply learn, over years, how to stand inside them without being knocked over. And, if you are lucky, how to find, somewhere in the repetition itself, a little pocket of your own quiet. By the time the ironing is folded away and the last of the evening chores have quietly finished themselves, the radio has become, without anyone quite deciding it should, the true center of the house's evening. The one voice from the wider world that has earned itself a place at this table, admitted carefully in small measured doses, the way you might admit a guest you like well enough, but do not wish to let overstay. It sits on the sideboard in the front room, a good wooden cabinet set with a dial that glows faintly amber in the dark, and your husband is the one who properly commands it. This too, like so much else in this house, was never negotiated aloud. It simply became understood sometime in the early years of your marriage that the radio in the evening belonged to him in roughly the way the newspaper belonged to him, or the good chair by the window belonged to him. He turns the dial with the unhurried authority of a man choosing among options that are in the end entirely his to choose among, and you have long since stopped minding this in any way you'd call resentment. Though there is, if you are honest with yourself in the particular honesty this quiet hour sometimes invites a small, persistent wish somewhere underneath it, that just once the choosing might be yours. Tonight, it is a dance band program. Strings and a smooth-voiced announcer reading out the names of hotels in cities you have never seen and likely never will. Toronto, Montreal, once in a while somewhere as far off as New York, cities that exist for you almost entirely as radio names sounds rather than places. The way a child might know the name of a star without ever having any real notion of the distance involved. On other nights it is a serial drama, 15 minutes of tightly wound plot that your daughter, when she is allowed to stay up for it, follows with a seriousness that makes you smile behind your mending. On Sunday evenings, it is more often than not a hymn program. And you have noticed, though you have never said this to another living soul, that your husband's shoulders come down further during the hymns than during almost anything else all week, as though some old church habit from his own boyhood still has a claim on him that nothing else quite manages to reach. There is a particular kind of attention that radio asks for, different from anything a flickering screen would ask. It asks you to build the pictures yourself. When the announcer describes the band on stage in their evening dress, you construct it. The lights, the sweep of a gown, a room you've never stood in and never will, assembled entirely out of a voice and your own imagination working quietly together in whatever part of your mind isn't currently occupied with darning a sock or shelling the last of the season's peas into a bowl in your lap. This building of pictures is not effortless, exactly. But neither is it work in the way ironing is work. It is more like the quiet exercise of a muscle you didn't know you had until you started using it, night after night, year after year, until it has become almost as natural as breathing, the habit of taking a little and making privately a great deal out of it. You wonder, sometimes, what it will be like when the television finally arrives in this house too, because it will, you know that much. The way you know the seasons will turn whether you're ready for them or not. Mrs. Whitfield talks about hers with a proprietary pride that borders some evenings on something almost like boasting, describing programs in such detail that you begin, despite yourself, to feel the small, ordinary envy of a woman whose neighbour has something she does not yet have. You suspect, though, again, this is a thought you keep entirely to yourself, that when it comes, the pictures will no longer need to be built. They will simply be given to you, fully formed, glowing there in the corner of the room, asking nothing of your imagination at all. And you are not certain. Turning this over quietly while your needle finds its way through a heel gone thin with wear, whether that will feel like a gift or like something quietly, almost imperceptibly, taken away. The children, when they are allowed to listen along, sit on the floor near the radio cabinet, in a posture you recognize from your own childhood, exactly. Knees drawn up, chin resting on folded arms, eyes fixed on the glowing dial, as though the dial itself were the source of the story, rather than merely the box that carries the voice. Your son likes the adventure serials best, something involving a Mountie and a wilderness and villains who always, reliably, get their comeuppance in the final 2 minutes. Your daughter prefers the dramas with women in them. Women who have troubles and secrets and occasionally romances. And you catch her sometimes mouthing lines along with the actresses, having memorized whole exchanges from repetition the way children memorize things without ever quite meaning to. There is scarcity in this, and you know it, though you would not use that particular word. The radio offers you perhaps 2 or 3 programs a night worth genuinely attending to, spread across an evening otherwise filled with music you only half hear and news you only half follow. This scarcity is not, you have come to think, entirely a hardship. A story that arrives only once a week at exactly the same hour becomes an event in a way that something endlessly available could never quite manage to be. Your daughter does not simply hear her serial. She waits for it all week in the particular sweet suffering of anticipation that makes Wednesday evenings feel, to a 9-year-old, like something close to a small holiday. You think folding down the mended sock and reaching for the next one in the basket, that there is a kind of discipline built into an evening like this one, that no one in the house has ever consciously chosen, and yet everyone in the house lives inside all the same. The radio is turned on at a particular hour and off at a particular hour. The choosing of what to listen to is limited, deliberate, and, because it is limited, somehow more carefully attended to than an evening with endless choice might ever be. You have nothing yet to compare this against. You do not know, cannot know what it will feel like, years from now, to have 100 choices glowing in a box instead of 2 or 3 voices arriving out of the air on their own fixed schedule. But tonight, in this room, with the strings playing low and your daughter's chin propped on her folded arms and your husband's shoulders, finally, properly down, the scarcity does not feel like a lag. It feels, if anything, like a shape, a container the evening can be poured into and held by, rather than an evening left shapeless and sprawling, filling every available minute simply because it can. You finish the sock. You reach for the next. There is a particular window in the front room, the one that looks out onto the street, framed by curtains your mother-in-law gave you the year you were married. A pale, sprigged cotton she chose herself without asking your opinion. And you have never once in 11 years sat in this room in the evening without some part of your attention resting faintly on what that window shows, and more importantly, on what it might show anyone looking back in. This is not something you would describe, if pressed, as worry, exactly. It is closer to a kind of ambient awareness, the same low-grade alertness with which you might notice weather without checking the sky directly. An instinct built up over years of living on a street where every house knows roughly what every other house is doing, and where the evidence of a family's private life is displayed, whether you intend it or not, in the lit rectangle of a front window after dark. You know, because you have walked this street yourself on winter evenings, exactly what your own house looks like from the outside at this hour. The warm gold light behind the curtains, a shape moving now and then across it, the general impression of a household properly settled for the night. You know this because you have looked without quite meaning to at the Hendricks place 2 doors down, and noted with the particular quiet judgment that passes for neighbourliness on a street like this one, that their light was still burning well past 10 the other night, and that Mrs. People Hendricks's curtains, if you're honest, have wanted washing for some weeks now. Visible even from the road in daylight, a small grey slackness in the fabric that says something about that household nobody would ever say aloud, but everybody, in their own way, notices. You do not think of yourself as a gossip. You would be genuinely wounded if anyone suggested it, and yet you understand in the particular unspoken economy of this street that a woman's peace at night is never entirely her own private matter. That it is, in some measure, a performance staged for an audience of neighbours who will never comment on it directly, but who will absolutely notice and quietly catalogue. Whether your children's boots are lined up neatly by the door when the milkman glimpses them through the gap in the curtain, whether your wash on the line was taken in before the rain or left out overnight, looking neglected, whether the light in your kitchen still burns at 11 suggesting either illness or some trouble that a well-run household oughtn't to be having. This is, you have come to understand without ever articulating it quite this plainly, even to yourself, one of the invisible engines that drives so much of what happens in this house after supper. The clearing of the table is not merely practical. A kitchen left in disorder overnight, glimpsed by a neighbour arriving unannounced for a cup of sugar, or an early morning word, would say something about you that you have no intention of allowing to be said. The ironing is not merely about your husband having a crisp collar for the office. It is about the whole family walking out that front door on Sunday morning, looking like a household that is managing, that is keeping up, that has not let anything slip. You think of Mrs. Dawkson 3 streets over, whose husband lost his position at the plant last winter, and how the whole street knew within a week, not because anyone said anything directly, but because her wash line thinned out, because the children's coats looked a season behind, because a certain confidence went out of the way she stood at her own front gate, exchanging the morning pleasantries. Nothing was ever said. Nothing needed to be. The street reads these things the way you read the creak of your own stairs fluently, without conscious effort, and there is no defence against that fluency except to make very sure every single evening that your own house gives nothing away that you have not chosen deliberately to let it give. This is exhausting if you allow yourself to think about it directly, which you generally do not, because thinking about it directly tends to curdle into something closer to resentment, and resentment is not a feeling this evening. This particular quiet hour with the radio low and the mending basket at your feet has any room for. Better to let it stay where it usually stays, beneath the surface, informing your movements without ever quite rising into a thought you'd have to sit with. And yet there is also, you must admit, something genuinely comforting buried inside this same watchfulness, something that is not merely burden. A street where everyone notices everything is also a street where something truly went wrong. A child sick in the night, a stove fire, a husband not come home when he ought to be. Someone would notice that too and come. You think of the winter 2 years past when your youngest ran a fever that properly frightened you, at 3 in the morning, and how Mrs. Alsop from next door, seeing your light burning at that unlikely hour through the gap in her own curtains, was at your door within 10 minutes in her housecoat, offering the name of a doctor and a jar of something for the fever, and more than either of those things, simply her presence, which mattered more than either could have on its own. So the watching cuts both ways. The street's eyes on your window are the same eyes that would come running if that window ever showed real trouble, instead of ordinary, well-managed evening peace. You do not know, standing at the edge of the front room, glancing at the curtain without quite meaning to how to feel about this fully, whether it is a comfort or a cage, whether the peace you keep every evening is entirely your own, or is in some real part borrowed from and owed to the street outside a performance so long practiced, it has become nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. Perhaps you think, folding a small sock over your knee, it does not need to be one or the other. Perhaps it is simply both the way. So much in this house is both the warmth of a well-kept kitchen and the labour that keeps it that way, the comfort of a settled street and the quiet, constant vigilance that settling requires. You glance once more at the window, at the pale sprigged curtain your mother-in-law chose without asking, and you find, without any real decision on your part, that your hand has already reached out and drawn it another inch closer against the glass ceiling, the warm gold light a little more fully inside, keeping this particular evening, whatever mixture of performance and genuine peace it is made of, exactly where it belongs. Your husband's chair sits at a precise angle to the front room window, close enough to the lamp for reading, angled just so toward the radio cabinet, and it has occurred to you more than once, dusting around its wooden arms on a Saturday morning, that this chair says more about the shape of your marriage than either of you would ever think to put into words. It was his before you were properly married, inherited, or so the story goes, from a bachelor uncle, reupholstered once in a serviceable brown when the original fabric wore through at the arms, and it has remained through 11 years and 2 children and 1 move across town, entirely and uncontestedly is in a way that nothing else in this house, not even the bed you share, has ever quite managed to be entirely anyone's. You have your own chair technically, a smaller one, less comfortable, angled toward the mending basket and the sewing table rather than toward the window or the radio. And you have never once sat in his by mistake, the way you might absent-mindedly reach for the wrong coat on a crowded hook. It is simply understood, the way so much in this house is simply understood, that certain furniture belongs to certain bodies, and that this belonging was decided somewhere before you arrived and has never once since been up for discussion. He settles into it now, newspaper under one arm, with the particular unthinking ease of a man lowering himself into the one seat in the entire world, built quite literally around the specific shape of his own body. Over years of nightly use, there is a small satisfied exhale that accompanies this settling, a sound you have come to recognize as the precise moment his working day finally fully ends. Not when he walks through the door, not even when supper is finished, but here in this chair, newspaper unfolded, feet extended slightly toward the small fire you've kept going in the grate since 5 o'clock. You watch this settling most evenings from wherever you happen to be standing. The doorway to the kitchen, perhaps drying your hands on your apron, or from your own smaller chair across the room, needle already threaded, and you feel watching it, a complicated mixture of things that you have never once tried to untangle fully, because untangling them would require admitting some of them to yourself, in language too plain to ignore afterward. There is tenderness in it. You have loved this man for 11 years, and there is something genuinely moving still in watching the particular way his shoulders come down once he's properly settled, the way a day's accumulated tension visibly drains out of him the moment he reaches this one specific chair in this one specific corner of the world. He has claimed as entirely, restfully his own. You think of him at the plant on his feet 12 hours some days, answering to men above him the way you answer to no one but the clock and your own conscience. And you understand, in a way you rarely say aloud, that he has earned this settling, this chair, this small evening kingdom of newspaper and low radio and firelight. But there is also, and this is the part you do not examine too closely, the way you do not examine the crack in the good teacup too closely for fear of noticing exactly how deep it runs, a quieter, less generous thought that surfaces some evenings and not others, depending on how tired you are, depending on how the day has gone. It is simply this, that he arrives home and within the hour is entirely at rest while you arrive at the exact same hour of the exact same hour of the exact same evening and are in every meaningful sense still working, clearing, washing, ironing, mending, listening for the children, tending the fire. He now sits in front of enjoying managing the small, invisible machinery of the household that does not, as far as you can tell, ever properly stop. You do not resent him for this. Not exactly, not in any way you could name cleanly as resentment. He works hard. You have never once doubted that. And the wage he brings home is the entire foundation this house is built on. The reason there is coal in the cellar and shoes on the children's feet. And, God willing, something a little extra saved toward Christmas. But there is a difference, you have come to understand without ever saying it to a living soul, between a day that ends and a day that simply changes shape. His day ends. Yours changes shape from the labour of the kitchen and the shop and the children's needs during daylight hours into a quieter, gentler seeming labour after supper, the mending, the ironing, the listening, the small ceaseless vigilance of the house that looks to anyone glancing in from outside very much like rest, and is not quite that. Not entirely, not ever, completely. You think of your own mother's kitchen and her mother's before that, and understand that you did not invent this arrangement any more than you invented the shape of the chair your husband sits in. It arrived the way most things in a marriage like yours arrive, inherited, unquestioned, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that questioning it now would feel less like a reasonable objection and more like questioning gravity, or the changing of the seasons, or any other fact of the natural world that simply is, regardless of what you might privately think about it on a quiet evening with your hands full of mending. And yet, and this is the thought that surfaces last quietest of all some nights, not surfacing at all, you notice too that within your own smaller domain, the kitchen, the mending basket, the whole invisible architecture of the evening that runs through your hands and no one else is there, is a kind of authority that is entirely uncontestedly yours, in exactly the way his chair is entirely his. He would not know, could not say where the darning wool is kept, or which of the children's socks are worth mending, and which have gone past saving, or how much flour remains in the bin, or on which Tuesday the coal delivery is due. In this one narrow sense, walking the perimeter of your own kitchen each evening is not so different from him settling into that chair. A small kingdom entirely known, entirely governed, entirely yours. However differently sized and differently rested the two kingdoms may be, you catch his eye once across the room, and he offers you the particular small smile that has meant for 11 years. Something warmer than words would manage. A private acknowledgement that requires no explanation because none has ever been needed between you. You smile back. You return to the sock in your lap. The fire settles with a soft collapse of embers. His newspaper turns a page. The boots by the door are the first thing you see when the children finally properly stop moving for the night. Two small pairs, damp still at the toe from an afternoon spent somewhere in the last of the day's light, set, or more often not set, but abandoned wherever they happen to be kicked off, in the general vicinity of the mat inside the back door. Bedtime, you have come to understand over 9 years of practicing it nightly, is not a single event but an entire second shift of labour disguised, almost successfully, as tenderness. And the boots are only its opening note. You begin most nights around 7:30, calling up the stairs in the particular rising two-note pattern that has over years become shorthand in this house for time to come in now, a call that requires no actual words to be understood by either child, though words generally accompany it anyway out of habit more than necessity. Your daughter comes first, always. She has, since she was small, possessed an internal clock more obedient than her brother's. arriving at the washstand with a kind of weary compliance that you privately suspect she inherited from you rather than from her father, who has never in his life arrived anywhere a full minute before he strictly had to. The washing is quick, practical, done at the basin in the cold back room, rather than drawing a full bath except on the appointed nights, Wednesdays and Saturdays, when the copper boiler is fired specifically for that purpose, and the whole house briefly smells of hot water and the strong yellow soap you buy in blocks from the general store. On ordinary nights it is simply a flannel wrung, nearly dry run over faces and hands and behind ears, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who knows that a child who goes to bed only half-washed will somehow mysteriously arrive at breakfast the next morning looking as though the washing never happened at all. Night clothes are a small ceremony of their own. Flannel in winter, thinner cotton in the brief mercy of summer, both hand-sewn some years back from a simplicity pattern you have long since memorized, taken in, and let out again. As each child has grown through it, you check without quite meaning to check the state of each garment as you help thread small arms through sleeves. A seam wanting mending here, a hem gone up too short there. Small motes filed away in the back of your mind for the mending basket for the next quiet evening hour that will in fact be spent addressing precisely this. Teeth are attended to with the tin of tooth powder kept on the shelf above the washstand, a task your daughter at 9 now manages largely on her own, though you check the result with a quick, practiced glance that misses nothing. Your son, younger and more easily distracted, requires more direct supervision, his attention wandering toward the window, toward some half-formed thought about tomorrow, toward anything at all except the actual task in front of him, and you find yourself repeating his name in the particular patient, slightly worn tone that mothers the world over have likely been using since the beginning of mothers, a tone that says without any real anger in it, "We are not finished yet. Please come back to me." And then, at last, the actual putting to bed. The part an outsider glancing in might genuinely mistake for the whole of it. The soft part. The part with a story if there's time for one and a kiss on the forehead and the particular tucking in that both children still, despite their occasional protests of being too old for such things, visibly settle into with real relief. You smooth the quilt. You check by habit more than real concern this late in the season that the window is latched properly against the night air. You listen for 1 full minute standing quietly in the doorway, with the lamp turned low to the sound of 2 small bodies finding their way, each in their own particular fashion, down into sleep. Your daughter, who goes still almost at once, her breathing settling into its slow night rhythm. Within minutes your son, who fidgets and resettles 2 or 3 times, muttering something indistinct before he too finally goes quiet. This is the part, if you are honest with yourself in this particular hour, that people mean when they talk about the sweetness of a mother's evening. This doorway, this lamp, this stillness settling over 2 small faces you have loved since before either of them had a face at all. And it is sweet. You would never deny that, would be genuinely wounded if anyone suggested you found no tenderness in it. But it is also, and this is the part that never gets said aloud in the magazines, or from the pulpit, or in any of the places where mothers are told what their evenings ought to feel like, the second full labour of your day disguised almost perfectly as its softest hour. The washing, the mending, noted, the story told, with patience even when your own eyes are heavy. The particular vigilance of listening for a fever's first small signs. The low grade, ceaseless calculation running underneath every gesture. Has she grown out of that night dress? Does he need new boots before the snow comes properly? Was that cough this afternoon nothing, or the beginning of something? All of it folded invisibly into 20 minutes that look from the doorway like nothing more than a mother saying goodnight. You think, standing in the dim hallway with the lamp's small light throwing your shadow long against the wall, of how strange it is that the most tender-looking hour of your day is also, if you count it honestly, among its most laborious, that love and work have become in this house in this particular decade of your life so thoroughly folded into each other that you could not, if pressed, draw a clean line between where the mothering ends and the managing begins. Perhaps there is no line. Perhaps that is simply what this kind of love looks like. In a kitchen and a back bedroom in a small Ontario town in the late 1950s, labour so total it has stopped registering as labour at all. Felt instead most nights simply as love, plain and whole and entirely without complaint. You turn the lamp down another notch. You pull the door most of the way closed, leaving the familiar 2-inch gap your daughter insists on, and your son has stopped noticing either way. And you carry the small damp boots from beside the back door to the warm spot near the stove where they will dry properly overnight. Ready, clean, dry, waiting for tomorrow's short walk to school, which will begin this whole quiet architecture over again from its very first stone. The mending basket lives beside your chair, a deep oval of woven splint, worn pale and smooth at the handles from years of being lifted and set down again. And by 9 o'clock most evenings it has become, without any deliberate decision on your part, the true occupation of what remains of the night. You do not remember choosing this basket. It arrived like so much else in this house as part of the furniture of your marriage, a wedding gift from an aunt who understood perhaps better than you did at 22 exactly what kind of evenings lay ahead of you. It has held in the years since every sock heel worn thin by growing feet, every trouser knee blown out on a schoolyard fence, every shirt collar frayed soft with washing, every hem let down and let down again as children stretch upward faster than any budget can properly keep pace with. There have been Christmases when this basket has held in its own quiet way the entire difference between a family that looked as though it was managing and a family that was not. A difference measured not in dollars but in the smallness and evenness of your stitches, in how well you could make an old thing pass at a glance for something newer than it was. Tonight it holds a pair of your son's trousers, the left knee gone through entirely in a way that suggests, without his needing to explain it, some specific and dramatic incident involving either offense, a dare, or both. You turn the fabric over in the lamplight, assessing. This is not a hole that will take a simple patch invisibly, not with trousers already patched once at the other knee last spring. You will need to set in a proper patch, cut from the inside seam allowance where the fabric is least faded, matched as closely as your eye and your scrap bag allow. You hold the torn edge up to the light for a moment, turning it the way you might study a small wound, deciding how deep the damage runs before you decide how to treat it. The needle finds its rhythm quickly, the way it always does once you've threaded it and knotted the end and settled into the particular posture your body has learned over 20 years of exactly this task, leaning slightly toward the lamp wrist angle just so, the whole of you gone quiet and economical in a way that nothing else in your day quite manages. There is no waste in mending, and you have come to love it a little for that reason. Though love feels like too strong a word for something so plainly, unglamorously useful, every stitch does exactly what it is meant to do. Nothing is decorative. Nothing is for show. It is the most honest kind of work you perform all day because no one will ever see it except the wearer. And the wearer, being 9 years old, will almost certainly never once think to notice or thank you for it. This is, you have come to understand, its own particular kind of invisibility, different from the invisibility of the swept floor or the ironed collar, which at least announce themselves indirectly through the general impression of a well-kept house. A mended knee, done properly, announces nothing at all. Its entire purpose is to disappear, to make it look as though the trousers were never torn in the first place, as though your son simply walked through his afternoon without incident, without cost, without you having spent 40 minutes by lamplight matching thread and setting stitches small enough to survive a dozen more washings. You think, not for the first time, that there is something almost paradoxical in the finest work you do being the work that leaves the least trace of itself. There is too a particular satisfaction in the physical economy of the stitch itself, the way a good mender learns to make each pass of the needle do double duty, catching and securing more thread with less motion than a careless hand would manage, so that what looks to an untrained eye like slow and patient work is in fact a highly practiced efficiency, refined across years until every wasted movement has been quietly trained out of your hands. You think of your own first attempts at this exact stitch as a girl of perhaps 8, your mother's patient corrections, the many small failures, thread knotted wrong stitches too large, a patch set crooked and needing to be picked out entirely and begun again, that eventually, through nothing more dramatic than repetition, resolved themselves into the effortless competence your hands now carry without your ever needing to think about it directly. You think working the needle through of the actual arithmetic underneath this task. The plain fact that a new pair of trousers costs money that this house does not have lying loose to spend on something a good mending could avoid entirely. You have never sat your husband down and explained this reasoning to him directly because it has never needed explaining. He simply understands in the general vague way men in this town understand such things, that his wife mends rather than replaces and approves of it the way he approves of most things you manage without his direct involvement, quietly, by never once asking a question that would require you to justify it. You wonder, sometimes, whether his not asking is a kind of trust or a kind of not wanting to know. And you've decided over the years that it does not much matter which. The trousers still need mending either way, but there is a particular loneliness folded into that quiet approval too, if you let yourself notice it, which mostly you don't. The precise calculation happening in your head right now, 39 cents a pound for the good beef, 12 cents for the thread, whether the coal will stretch through February, whether your daughter will need a proper winter coat this year, or whether last year's let down at the hem again will see her through one more season. This calculation is entirely yours to carry hour after hour, evening after evening, invisible to everyone in the house except you. Your husband brings home a wage and trusts, correctly, that it will somehow become food and heat and mended trousers. He does not know how narrow that trust sometimes runs, how many small substitutions and postponements and careful economies stand between his wage arriving on Friday and the family eating well through the following Thursday. He does not know because you have never told him, and you have never told him because some old instinct inherited perhaps from your own mother's kitchen insists that a husband ought never to feel the weight of an economy that a wife can manage on her own. There is a particular arithmetic ritual, too, that accompanies certain kinds of mending. The mental note of what this repair has saved you, set against what it has cost you in time you might otherwise have spent resting. You have never once totaled these hours across a year because you suspect if you did the number would be too large to look at comfortably. The way you avoid totaling certain other numbers in this house, the years remaining on the mortgage, the true cost of raising 2 children to adulthood, the precise sum of everything you have quietly given up, without ever framing it to yourself as a giving up at all. You set the patch working the needle in small, even stitches, around its edge matching the weave as best you can, and you think, not bitterly but plainly, the way you might note the weather, that there is a particular kind of pride buried in this invisibility too. No one will ever know these trousers were torn. No one will ever know what it cost you, in either coin or evening hours, to make them whole again. And there is something in that anonymous competence that satisfies you in a way that praise, had anyone thought to offer it, might not have managed quite as well. You do not need your husband to notice the mended knee. You need mostly for the knee to be mended for your son to walk into school tomorrow in trousers that give no sign of the fence or the dare, or the 40 minutes of lamplight it took to make the evidence disappear. The clock on the mantel strikes the half hour. You set the trousers aside finished and reach into the basket for the next thing. A sock this time, one of a pair you have already turned twice at the heel, and which you privately suspect has perhaps one more mending left in it, before it must be surrendered entirely to the rag bin. You slit the darning egg inside, feel for the thin place with your thumb, and begin again, the needle moving in its small crosswise weave over and under, filling the worn place thread by careful thread until it is once more whole enough to survive another season of a boy's restless feet. You think as your hands settle into the familiar motion of your own mother teaching you this exact stitch at a table, not unlike this one, her hands guiding yours the way your hands might one day guide your own daughter's. Though your daughter at 9 has shown so far more interest in books than in needlework, A fact that pleases and faintly worries you in roughly equal measure, for reasons you have never quite untangled. You want her to have an easier evening than this one someday. You are not entirely sure what an easier evening would even look like, having never lived one yourself past the age of about 12. You remember the winter your daughter, then 6, tore her one good winter coat on a fence nail on her way home from school, arriving at the door in tears, certain she had ruined something irreplaceable, certain the punishment would match the scale of her fear. You had knelt down in the front hall, coat still on her small shaking shoulders, and told her, with more calm than you entirely felt at the time, that nothing in this house was ever quite so ruined as it first appeared. You had mended the tear that same evening so seamlessly that by Sunday she had forgotten which side of the coat had ever been torn at all, and you had thought, watching her walk to church that morning without a second thought for the coat she wore, that this was perhaps the truest thing you had to teach her. Not that things never broke, but that breaking was rarely the end of a thing's usefulness, provided someone was willing to sit down with a needle and put in the time to prove it. There is a strange comfort, you think, in worry that has a shape you can actually hold in your hands. The larger worries of the world, the ones that arrive sometimes through the radio, distant and unplaceable wars and elections and troubles in countries you will never see, those worries have no shape, nothing to do with your two hands, except listen and feel small and helpless before them. But this worry, the worry of a torn knee, of a thinning heel of a coat that may not last the winter, this worry you can actually address, stitch by stitch, evening by evening, and there is something almost merciful in that. You cannot mend the whole world, but you can mend the whole world. But you can mend this sock, and for tonight, in this chair, by this lamp, that feels like enough. There is a particular hierarchy, too, that governs which garments in this house receive the fullest measure of your care and which are permitted to age gracelessly toward the rag bin without protest. Your husband's good shirt for church receives attention that a work shirt never would. Your daughter's Sunday dress, handed down now from a cousin in Peterborough and already taken in twice, is examined each week for any sign of strain at the seams long before the strain becomes visible to anyone else's eye. Underthings, by contrast, are mended with a plainer, faster hand, since no one but you and the wearer will ever see the evidence of a stitch gone slightly crooked in the dark. You have never written this hierarchy down anywhere, and yet you could recite it without hesitation, the way you could recite the order of hymns on a Sunday you've attended 100 times before. You think, sometimes, of the particular economy of scraps. The box kept beneath the sewing table, filled with pieces too small for any single further use, and yet too good, somehow, to throw away entirely. A square of your daughter's old nightdress. A strip of flannel from a shirt worn through at the elbow years ago. A button, saved, though you could not now say from what garment it originally came. This box is its own kind of memory. You think a physical record of every piece of clothing that has passed through this house and been used until it could be used no further, then broken down into its smallest useful parts before finally reluctantly being allowed to end. There is something almost respectful in this refusal to waste, you think. Not merely thrift, though it is certainly that, but a kind of quiet honoring of the labor that went into the original garment. A way of saying that nothing made with this much care ought to be discarded before every last thread of its usefulness has been properly spent. The basket, when at last you set the finished sock atop its mended companion and glance inside, is not empty. It is never quite empty. Not truly. Not in a house with 2 growing children and 1 working man and a budget that asks you to make things last well past their natural season. But it is lighter than it was an hour ago. And that lightening, small and temporary as it is, carries you the last stretch of the evening, the way a good meal carries you through an afternoon's labor. Not permanently, not without needing repeating, but enough for tonight to feel like something accomplished. There is a particular 5 minutes most nights somewhere between the last of the mending and the eventual climb up to bed when the house falls quiet enough that you allow yourself something you would never admit to calling indulgence. Though that is precisely what it is, a last cup of tea made fresh drunk alone, standing at the kitchen table in the dark, with only the small glow from the front room reaching faintly through the doorway. You do not sit for this. Sitting, somehow, would turn it into a proper break, a thing that might be noticed and questioned, and you have never quite allowed yourself the full permission of that. Standing feels instead like something briefer, something almost accidental. A woman who happened to put the kettle on and happened to drink from it before heading up, rather than a woman who deliberately carved 5 private minutes out of an evening that by rights belongs to everyone in this house except her. You have thought about this distinction more than once, standing right here, and have never quite managed to decide whether it's a small dishonesty you tell yourself or simply the shape a private thing takes when it has never once been given formal permission to exist. The tea itself is nothing special. A strong dark blend, bought loose from the general store, brewed in the same brown pot that has served this kitchen since before you were married. It's spout-chipped in a place your thumb has learned over years to avoid without thinking. You take it black, or nearly so. A habit that began during the war years, when sugar was the kind of thing you learned to want less of, simply because wanting it more served no purpose, and has stayed with you since, less out of continued necessity now than out of the plain fact that some habits, once set deep enough, outlive the reasons that created them. You wonder sometimes how many of your habits are like that. Begun for reasons long since resolved, kept only because keeping them requires no thought at all, while changing them would require a decision you have never quite had the spare energy to make. You stand at the table in the near dark, the cup warm between your 2 palms, and you let yourself for these few minutes think about nothing in particular, which, as you have come to understand, an entirely different exercise from thinking about nothing at all, and one that takes a certain amount of practice to manage properly. Your mind still moves. It simply moves without direction, drifting in across the surface of the day rather than working through any one part of it, the way your eye might drift across a familiar room without landing anywhere long enough to really look. Tonight, though, it catches on something, the way it sometimes does, and holds there a moment before you can steer it elsewhere. You think of Mrs. Pace's, Whitfield's new television, and the particular tone she used describing it at the corner store this afternoon. A tone that was not quite boasting, not quite anything you could object to directly, but that left you feeling afterward a faint and unwelcome smallness you have not entirely shaken off even now. Hours later, standing here with your tea, you think of the fact that her husband's position at the bank pays by any reasonable guess perhaps a third more than your own husband brings home from the plant, and that this difference, never spoken of directly between the two of you, nonetheless sits underneath every ordinary exchange you have with her, every comparison of curtains, every mention of what the children are wearing to school this year, every casual remark about what's for supper. You are not, you tell yourself, a woman given to envy. You believe this about yourself with real sincerity, and mostly it is true. But there is a particular ache, small and specific, that arrives on evenings like this one, standing alone with a cup of plain tea in a dark kitchen, at the thought of a life just one register more comfortable than your own. Not wealth. Nothing so dramatic as that. Simply a small margin of ease that would mean not calculating quite so closely whether the beef can be 39 cents this week, not turning a sock twice before admitting it's finished, not doing the particular quiet arithmetic that has become as automatic to you as breathing, and that you suspect, though you have no way of knowing for certain, does not trouble Mrs. Whitfield's evenings in quite the same way. You do not resent her for this. That would require a kind of directness you were not raised to practice. Instead, you feel something quieter and harder to name, a kind of comparison that runs underneath the surface of every ordinary friendliness, checked and rechecked, without your ever quite meaning to check it, the way your tongue might return, again and again, to a slightly sore tooth, whose curtains are newer, whose children's coats came from the catalogue this year, rather than being let down again from last winter's, who has a television and who does not, and what that single fact seems, unfairly and completely, to say about a household's whole position in the world. You drink the tea. It is good and hot, and entirely your own for these few minutes, and you remind yourself, the way you remind yourself most nights around this same hour, that this house is a good house, warm and clean and well run, that your children are fed and clothed, and by any honest measure loved as thoroughly as any children on this street. You remind yourself that Mrs. Prodie Whitfield, for all her television and her husband's bank wage, lost a baby 2 winters back, a fact the whole street knows and never speaks of, and that whatever margin of ease her household enjoys, it has not spared her that particular grief, nor could any amount of money ever have done so. You think, too, of the particular afternoon last spring when you and Mrs. Reishan Whitfield had sat together on her porch shelling peas from your respective gardens, an ordinary hour that had, without either of you quite planning it, turned into something closer to honesty than either of you usually permitted yourselves on this street. She had confessed quietly between one handful of pods and the next that the television had been her husband's idea more than her own, that she sometimes found the noise of it more exhausting than restful, that she missed, more than she'd expected, to the particular quiet of an evening spent simply talking the way the two of you were talking now. You had not known what to do with this confession at the time, had murmured something sympathetic and let the subject drift elsewhere. But you have carried it with you since, a small private correction to the story you'd been telling yourself about her house being simply uncomplicatedly easier than your own. This thought settles something in you, the way it usually does, not because you take any pleasure in another woman's sorrow, you would be horrified at the suggestion, but because it reminds you gently and without cruelty that every house on this street is carrying something, that the lit window and the clean curtain tell you only the smallest fraction of what actually lives inside a family, and that comparing your own house's particular burdens against another house's particular blessings, as you have just spent 5 quiet minutes doing, is a game with no honest winner. Only a woman standing alone in her kitchen making herself feel smaller than she has any real reason to feel. You think too of your own mother's kitchen, and how she never once, in all the years you watched her, seemed troubled by what the neighbours had that she did not. You are not certain whether this was true peace, or simply a kind of practiced calm she never let you see behind. And you find yourself wishing, standing here in the dark with your cup nearly empty, that you had thought to ask her while you still could have. There are questions you are beginning to understand that only occur to a person once she has arrived at the exact age and exact kitchen where the answer would have mattered most, and by then, so often, the person who could have answered is no longer there to ask. You finish the tea. You rinse the cup at the basin, quick and quiet, and set it on the rack beside the others, upside down in its place. The 5 minutes are over now, folded back into the ordinary run of the evening, indistinguishable to anyone who might ask about your day tomorrow from any other 5 minutes in it. No one will ever know you stood here, alone, drinking tea in the dark and measuring your own life against your neighbour's. It will simply be one more invisible thing this kitchen has held and released, the way it holds and releases so much else. Grief arithmetic. Small envies, small mercies, all of it absorbed into the linoleum and the oilcloth and the particular quiet of this one room at this 1 hour, and never once spoken aloud to another living soul. You think too of the particular ritual of the teapot itself, how it has sat on this same shelf for 11 years, refilled and emptied more times than you could ever hope to count, and how strange it is that an object so plain and so constantly used should carry none the less such a specific weight of memory. It was a gift from your husband's mother, given somewhat grudgingly, you always suspected, in the early months of your marriage, when she was still deciding whether you were quite the wife her son deserved. You have never been entirely certain you passed that particular examination. But the teapot has stayed, regardless, has poured out 11 years of mornings and evenings alike, has become, without either woman ever intending it, a kind of quiet peace treaty between you, proof, poured out cup after cup after cup, that whatever early doubts existed have long since been outlasted by simple daily use. There is a particular pleasure, too, in the 5 minutes belonging to no clock but your own. Every other portion of your evening answers to some outside rhythm. Supper at a fixed hour because your husband's stomach and his employer's schedule demand it. Bedtime at a fixed hour because a child who stays up too late becomes by morning a child. No one in the house can properly manage the ironing on Tuesdays because Tuesday has always been ironing day in your mother's house, as in yours. for reasons neither of you have ever needed to examine. But these 5 minutes standing here with the cup cooling slowly in your hands answer to nothing but your own tiredness and your own small private wish to feel, if only briefly, like a woman, rather than merely a function performed on behalf of everyone else in this house. You have never once let yourself imagine what a whole hour of such time might feel like. 5 minutes, you have decided, is already more than most women you know permit themselves, and asking for more would feel, somehow, like tempting a kind of luck you are not entirely sure you are owed. And yet, walking away from the table toward the last few tasks of the evening, you notice that the smallness has already begun to lift. The way morning frost lifts once the sun properly clears the roofline next door. It does not vanish all at once, but it thins and softens, and by the time you reach the hallway it has become simply one more thread in the evening's larger fabric, rather than the whole of the cloth. Later, when the house has gone properly quiet, the children long asleep, your husband's chair finally empty, the radio switched off for the night with its small definitive click, you find yourself, more often than you would ever admit to anyone, drawn back one last time to the darkened windows of the front room, standing there a moment with your arms wrapped loosely around yourself against the evening chill that has crept in now that the fire's been banked low. Outside, the street has gone almost entirely dark. A porch light 2 doors down, the Alsops, still burns, a small steady gold against the deep blue-black of the yard beyond it. Somewhere further off a car passes, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of your own front room, in a long pale arc, before disappearing again, leaving the dark thicker than before, the way light always seems to when it withdraws. The wind has settled some since earlier. You can hear it moving through the bare branches of the elm at the corner of the yard, a low, steady murmur rather than the sharper voice it had a few hours ago, and beneath that fainter still, the particular hush of frost beginning to settle over the grass, a sound so quiet you are not entirely certain you are hearing it at all, rather than simply remembering the sound from every October before this one. There is something in standing at a dark window, looking out at a dark street, that makes the warmth behind you feel more complete than it would otherwise feel on its own. You have noticed this before, though you have never quite managed to explain it to yourself in words that satisfied you. The cold glass under your fingertips, the black yard beyond it, the small hard fact of a world out there that does not care in the slightest whether you are warm or fed or loved. All of it seems, somehow, to make the room behind you, the banked fire, the sleeping children upstairs, the husband already gone up ahead of you, feel less like an ordinary arrangement of furniture and family, and more like something you built deliberately, against exactly this kind of dark. You think of winter nights still to come, months of them stretching ahead through November and December and the long grey weight of January and February. Nights when the wind off the lake will find every gap in this house's old windows, and the children will need an extra blanket, and the coal bill will climb the way it climbs every year, regardless of how carefully you've budgeted for it. You think of this without dread, exactly. Though there is a certain bracing in the thought, the way there is a certain bracing in stepping outside on the first properly cold morning of the season. This house has weathered 11 winters already, since you and your husband first moved into it as newlyweds, with almost nothing beyond a bed, a table, and this same front window with its sprigged curtains not yet even hung. It will weather this one too. You have never once doubted that even in the worst of it, even in the January 2 years back when the furnace failed for 3 days running and you kept the children warm with hot bricks wrapped in flannel, and every blanket the house owned piled onto 2 narrow beds, you remember standing here, the particular fear of that week. Not dramatic fear, nothing you'd have spoken of even to your own husband in so many words, but a low steady thrum of worry that sat behind your ribs for 3 straight days. The worry of a mother watching her children's breath cloud faintly in a bedroom too cold to be entirely safe, wondering whether the repairman would come tomorrow or the day after, whether the coal would stretch, whether you were doing enough, whether enough was even a thing that existed in a week like that one. The furnace was fixed on the 4th day. You have never forgotten those 3 nights. nor the particular relief of the first evening afterward when the pipes ticked warm again and you stood in this exact spot feeling something close to gratitude, so large it had nowhere proper to go except into your own quiet tears, shed here alone at this window where no one could see them, and ask what was wrong. There is safety in this street, you think, standing at the glass. A particular kind of safety that comes precisely from the fact that everyone can be seen, that nothing here happens entirely unwitnessed, but the same watchfulness which sometimes feels in daylight, like a faint pressure to keep up appearances, becomes, at this late hour, something closer to a genuine comfort. If your house were the only lit window on an empty road, the darkness pressing in from every side with nothing else nearby to answer it, you suspect this same standing at the window would feel entirely different. Lonely, more exposed, a small fortress rather than one house, among many, each one holding its own particular warmth against the same shared dark. But it is not the only lit window, not truly, even now with most of the street gone dark for the night. You know without needing to see it directly that behind every one of these dark facades a family very much like your own has just finished its own version of this same evening. Its own supper cleared, its own children put to bed, its own particular collection of joys and worries folded quietly away until morning. You do not know the specific shape of what burns inside each of those houses. You know only your own. But there is a comfort standing here at the edge of your own private evening in understanding that the whole street is in its way, engaged in the same quiet work you have spent this evening performing, the work of taking an ordinary day and turning it through 100 small unglamorous acts into something that can be safely set down and left until morning. The frost is thickening now on the outside of the glass, a fine white lace beginning to bloom at the corners of the pane, and you press one finger briefly against it, feeling the particular sharp cold of it even through the barrier of glass. A small private ritual you have performed on nights like this since childhood, without ever once examining why. Perhaps it is simply to confirm in some small physical way that the cold out there is real, that the warmth in here is a genuine achievement, rather than merely the absence of something else, that the boundary between the two, this pane of glass, this thin wall of clapboard and plaster and horsehair insulation, is doing exactly the quiet, unglamorous work it was built to do. You think of the young couple who moved into the Redmond place last spring, newlyweds, barely into their 20s, and how you had watched across the intervening months their own front windows slowly take on the particular rhythm every window on the street eventually takes on. Curtains hung, then a lamp appearing in the front room, then more recently a wash line that has begun to carry, some weeks, the small unmistakable shapes of infant clothing. You do not know this young woman well yet, have exchanged with her little more than the ordinary pleasantries of two neighbours passing at the mailbox, but you find yourself standing at your own window some evenings, glancing toward hers with something like solidarity, understanding better than almost anyone else on this street could exactly what particular exhaustion and exactly what particular tenderness her own evenings have likely just begun to hold, and wishing, without ever having said so aloud, that someone had been half so honest with you about it when you were standing exactly where she now stands. You think, too, of the particular geography of this street as you have come to know it over 11 years, which houses hold happy marriages and which hold something more strained behind their neat curtains, which families are, by whatever quiet measure a neighbour uses, thriving, and which are simply managing week to week the way so many families are simply managing this year and every year. You do not judge this geography unkindly. You have lived inside enough of your own hard weeks to know that a family's worst season, glimpsed from outside, rarely tells the whole truth of who they are underneath it. And yet you cannot help but map it anyway, the way you cannot help but notice the shape of a familiar room even in the dark. Some information once learned simply will not leave you, whether or not you ever intend to use it for anything at all. You think, standing here, of the particular sound the street makes in deep winter versus tonight's milder autumn hush, how snow, once it is properly settled, seems to absorb sound entirely, wrapping the whole neighbourhood in a silence so complete that a single set of boots crunching home late from a shift at the plant can be heard from 3 houses away, unmistakable, almost intimate in its clarity. You have learned over winters to recognize your own husband's particular tread from that distance, the slight hitch in his gait, from an old injury he never speaks of, arriving home from a late shift on those rare occasions when the plant runs one and you have stood at this exact window on nights just like that, watching for the shape of him under the street lamp long before he reaches the gate, feeling something in your chest ease the moment you spot him. You think too of the particular way this window has marked the seasons of your marriage without your ever intending it to serve that purpose. The summer evenings early on, when you and your husband, still new to each other and to this house, would sit together on the front step long after the children, who did not yet exist, were even a consideration, watching the street settle for the night together in a companionable silence that asked nothing of either of you. You think of the autumn you learned you were carrying your daughter standing at this exact window with a secret still too new and too fragile to share even with him, watching the street below with a private wonder that belonged for those few weeks entirely to you alone. The window has not changed in 11 years, but you have stood before it as so many different versions of yourself that it has become, without your ever noticing the accumulation, a kind of quiet witness to the whole shape of your adult life. There is a particular vulnerability too, in this hour, that you rarely allow yourself to examine directly. Standing at a dark window at night, alone with your family asleep behind you, is one of the few moments in your day when you are entirely without task, without role, without anyone requiring anything of you at all. And you have noticed more than once that this absence of demand can feel paradoxically almost as unsettling as it is restful. You have spent so many years being needed in some specific, concrete way at every hour of your waking life, that a moment with no claim upon you feels, at first, almost like standing on ground that isn't quite solid. It takes a few seconds, most nights, before you can settle fully into it, before the strangeness of simply existing unrequired gives way to something closer to peace. You draw the curtain closed at last. That same pale Spriggs cotton your mother-in-law chose, without asking, sealing the room's small remaining warmth fully in against the night. And you stand there one moment longer in the dark, listening to the house settle around you. The furnace ticking faintly below a floorboard somewhere upstairs. Your own held breath let quietly out, before you turn finally toward the stairs and the last small tasks of the evening still waiting to be done. The kitchen table, when you pass back through it on your way to check the stove one final time before bed, has by this hour returned entirely to the state you left it in after supper, plain ordered waiting. The salt and pepper shakers with their tiny painted violets standing exactly at its center, where they have stood every night for 11 years. You pause here a moment, hand resting flat against the oilcloth, and feel, not for the first time this evening, the particular weight of being the one person in this house who keeps its rhythm running. It is not a resentful thought, though you would forgive yourself if it were. It is simply an observation arriving at this late hour, with the particular clarity that quiet and tiredness together sometimes bring, that every single object in this room exists exactly where it exists, because you decided at some point that it should, and have maintained that decision night after night, through 11 years of suppers and washings and Tuesday ironings, without a single one of them ever once being written down or formally agreed to. Your husband could not tell you which drawer holds the string, or where the spare buttons are kept, or on what day of the week the ashes need clearing from the stove. Your children growing, though, they are still assume, in the unthinking way of children everywhere, that clean shirts and hot suppers and dry boots by the door simply happen the way weather happens, arriving each day through some process they have never once had cause to examine. You are the process. You have been the process for 11 years, and you will in all likelihood continue being the process for a great many years yet to come. And there are nights, this one, standing here with your hand flat on the cool oilcloth in the near dark, when the sheer scale of that fact settles over you with a weight that has nothing to do with resentment and everything to do with something closer to awe at your own quiet, unremarked capacity. You built this, not the house itself which your husband's wage pays for, and which stands regardless of anything you do or don't do inside it, but the rhythm of it, the particular daily order that makes it feel, to everyone who lives here, like a home, rather than merely a structure with a roof. You think of your own mother in her kitchen in Belleville performing some version of this same nightly accounting decades before you were even born, and her mother before that in a kitchen you never saw, in a country some of your family left before you were born, carrying this same invisible labor across an ocean and settling it down again in a new place with barely a pause. You understand standing here one link in a chain of women stretching back further than you could trace even if you tried, each of them keeping some version of this exact rhythm. The table cleared, the fire banked, the children checked one last time before sleep, and each of them you suspect feeling some version of this exact particular tiredness, at some version of this exact particular hour, in kitchens scattered across more countries and more centuries than you could ever properly count. You think too of a conversation you overheard once entirely by accident between two older women at the church basement social last spring. Women well past the years of raising young children, women whose kitchens had presumably gone quieter, less demanding than yours currently is. One had said to the other in a tone that carried no bitterness at all, only a kind of weathered clarity, that the strange thing about this particular work was that you only truly understood its size once you'd set enough of it down to look back at the shape of it. Whole, you had not been meant to hear this, had busied yourself pointedly with the coffee urn, rather than let on that you were listening. But the sentence had stayed with you since returning now unbidden, in this dark kitchen at 10:30. The suggestion that perhaps you would not fully understand until many years from now. Exactly how much you had carried quietly through evenings just like this one. There is a loneliness in this, and there is also somehow in the very same breath a companionship in it. Though the person you'd be keeping company with is not in the room, has never been in the room, exists only as a kind of felt presence reaching backward through your own mother and grandmother. And however many women before them, you are not, in this sense, alone at all. Even standing here by yourself in a dark and quiet kitchen at 10:30 at night, you are simply the current keeper of something very old, passed down hand to hand, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without ever once being formally named. And you understand, without any real sadness in the thought, pass it eventually to your own daughter, who is at this moment 9 years old and asleep upstairs, and who has already, without either of you quite noticing it happening, begun to learn the shape of this same rhythm simply by watching you perform it night after night at this same table. You wonder, standing here, what your daughter's kitchen will look like 20 or 30 years from now, whether the television that has not yet arrived in this house will have arrived in hers by then, filling her evenings with something other than radio and mending. Whether the labor you perform every night, invisible and unpaid and largely unacknowledged, will still be entirely hers to perform alone, or whether the world will have shifted by then into some shape you cannot presently imagine, one where a husband might know where the spare buttons are kept, might notice on his own that a shirt wants ironing, might understand, without being told, the particular weight of keeping a household's rhythm running night after night without a single day off. You do not know the answer to this. You suspect, if you are honest, that some of it will change and much of it will not. That the particular shape of a woman's evening labor has a way of outlasting whatever changes arrive around it, simply taking new forms rather than disappearing entirely. But you find, standing here with your hand on the cool oilcloth, that you do not mind the not knowing quite as much as you might have expected to. Whatever shape her kitchen takes, whatever her particular version of this table and this hour comes to look like, you trust, quietly without needing proof of it, that she will carry inside her, whether she ever consciously notices it or not. This same capacity you are only now at this late and tired hour allowing yourself to properly name, the capacity to take an ordinary day apart at the seams by evening and stitch it back into order with nothing more than her own two hands and a rhythm nobody ever wrote down for her because nobody ever needed to. You think too of the particular satisfaction that comes from being needed in this specific concrete way, not admired, not celebrated, simply needed the way a house needs its foundation, quietly and constantly, and without ever once thinking to say thank you to the ground it stands on. There have been nights harder ones than this, when that need has felt like something closer to weight than honor. When you have stood exactly where you are standing now and felt the whole shape of your life pressing down with a heaviness you did not have words generous enough to soften. Tonight is not one of those nights. Tonight feels instead like something closer to purpose. The specific, unglamorous purpose of a woman who knows with real and quiet certainty that this house would not run without her, and finds in that certainty something worth more in this particular moment than any of the small envies or aches that visited her earlier in the evening. You remember quite suddenly a particular afternoon, 3 winters back, when your own mother came to stay for a week, while you recovered from a bad bout of influenza, and how strange and disorienting it had felt to lie upstairs, genuinely unwell, listening to someone else move through the rhythms of your own kitchen below. The wrong cupboard opened first. The stove lit a little differently than you'd have lit it. Your children's voices calling questions to a grandmother instead of a mother. Questions about where things were kept that they would never have needed to ask you. You had recovered within the week, had come back downstairs to a kitchen that was on the whole well enough managed. And yet you had noticed quietly a dozen small things done not quite the way you would have done them. A way of folding towels, a way of sweeping into the corners, a way of managing the children's small daily disagreements. And you had understood, watching your own mother pack her case to return home, that a kitchen run by someone else, even someone who loves this family every bit as much as you do, is never quite the same kitchen at all. It is a kind of proof, however unwelcome, of how entirely singular your own particular rhythm actually is. You think too of the particular loneliness of being irreplaceable in ways no one has ever thought to acknowledge as a skill at all. If your husband fell ill tomorrow, the whole street would know within the day. Casseroles would appear on the step, the minister would call his absence from the plant, would be noted and discussed and in its way honoured as a genuine disruption to the ordinary run of things. If you fell ill tomorrow, and this thought arrives, as it always does, with a small cold clarity, you neither invite nor entirely welcome. The house would simply stop quietly, and without ceremony, the suppers uncooked. The shirts unironed, the children managed however clumsily. Your husband and perhaps your own mother summoned from Belleville could manage between them, and no one you suspect would think to call this a disruption at all. They would call it, instead, an inconvenience, a temporary gap to be filled until you were well again, as though the entire architecture of this household were not, in fact, built and maintained by your 2 hands alone. You do not dwell in this thought long, because dwelling in it serves no purpose. You can identify beyond a certain grim satisfaction in having named something true. Instead, you let it pass through you, the way you let most such thoughts pass through you at this hour. Noted, weighed and set back down, because there is washing to be done tomorrow, regardless of whether tonight's reflections have resolved anything at all. This too, you understand, is its own kind of skill. One you were never taught directly, but absorbed the way you absorbed everything else in this kitchen. The skill of thinking a hard thought fully through to its end and then simply continuing on, because continuing on is, in the end, the only response available to a woman in your position that actually changes anything for the better. You straighten the shakers a final half-inch, though they hardly need it. You look once more around the room, clean, ordered, waiting for tomorrow, and you feel, beneath the tiredness, something that might, on a more generous night, deserve to be called pride. The last tasks of the evening are small enough individually to pass almost without notice, and yet together they form as deliberate and complete a ceremony as any church service you have ever sat through. The closing of a day performed the same way in the same order night after night, until the sequence has worn itself as smooth and automatic in your hands as the 3rd stairs creak is familiar to your ear. You check the stove first, as you always do, opening the small iron door to assess the state of the fire within. It has burned down now to a low, steady bed of coals banked earlier with a careful shovel of ash to slow it through the night. Enough warmth left to take the worst chill off the kitchen by morning, without needing feeding again until you rise. You add nothing more. This too is a calculation you perform automatically, now weighing the coal remaining in the cellar bin against the weeks of winter still ahead, erring always on the side of slightly less warmth tonight, in favour of slightly more certainty. Come February, You move to the back door, next testing the latch with a particular firm twist that confirms it's properly caught, and you glance out of habit rather than real expectation of finding anything amiss at the boots set to dry by the stove, at the coats hung on their hooks in the particular order. Your husband's on the end nearest the door. Then the children's smaller ones arranged by height. That has never once in 11 years been consciously decided, and has also somehow never once been disturbed. There is comfort in an order that maintains itself, you think, passing your hand briefly over the smallest coat. Your son's, the wool gone soft and slightly matted at the cuffs from a season of small hard use. The front door receives the same attention. Latch tested, the small bolt slid across a habit begun years ago after a story went round the street about a house broken into 2 towns over a story that turned out, on closer inquiry, to be considerably exaggerated, but that has left its mark regardless in this small nightly ritual that costs you nothing and buys in exchange a measure of peace you would not trade back, even knowing now how unlikely the original danger probably was. You have come to think of this bolt less as protection against any real threat, and more as a kind of punctuation mark, a small physical way of saying to the house and to yourself that the day is now officially finished. You turn down the lamp in the front room, watching the flame shrink and gutter, and finally extinguish itself with a small final flare, the room dropping into a darkness broken only by the faint orange glow of the banked fire in the grate. You stand there a moment in that near dark, the way you always do, letting your eyes adjust, feeling the particular hush that settles over a room the instant its last light goes out. A hush different in quality from ordinary quiet, heavier, somehow more final, the specific silence of a day genuinely, completely finished rather than merely paused. There is a particular quality to the house at this exact hour, past 10, and moving toward 11, that exists at no other point in the day, a stillness so complete that even the ordinary creaks and settlings of the structure itself seem to arrive more slowly, more deliberately, as though the house too were winding down toward its own kind of rest. You have always thought, though you have never said this to anyone, that a house has something like a temperament, a way of holding itself through its different hours, and that this one, your one, is at its gentlest and most trustworthy right here in this particular stretch of quiet, between the last task finished and the first true approach of sleep. You climb the stairs, avoiding the loose board on the second to last step, out of habits so old you no longer consciously register doing it, and you pause first at your daughter's door, easing it open the familiar 2 inches she insists on checking by the thin moonlight through her curtain, that she is properly covered, that her breathing has settled into its slow, steady night rhythm, that nothing in the room has shifted since you checked it an hour before at bedtime proper. She has not moved, one arm flung above her head in the particular abandon of a child's sleep. An abandon you remember faintly from your own childhood, and have not felt in your own body for so many years you could not now say exactly when it left you. You think standing in this doorway of the particular privilege of being the last person to see your children each night before sleep entirely claims them, a privilege so ordinary you rarely think to name it as one. And yet, standing here now, you understand with real clarity that there will come a day not so distant as you'd like to believe, when this daughter will no longer live in this house at all, when this doorway and this 2-inch gap and this particular slant of moonlight across her narrow bed will belong only to memory. You do not dwell on this thought long enough to let it turn to sorrow, but you let it linger a moment, the way you might let your hand linger a moment longer than necessary on a banister you know you will not always have. Your son's door next, and here the checking takes a moment longer because he has kicked his blanket half off, as he does most nights, and you draw it gently back up over his shoulder without waking him, feeling beneath your palm the particular warmth of a sleeping child. A warmth that has across 9 years of nights, just like this one, never once failed to still something in you that nothing else in the day quite manages to reach. You stand a moment longer than strictly necessary, watching the slow rise and fall of his small chest, and you think, as you think most nights at this exact point in the ceremony, of how impossibly quickly this particular warmth is passing, How the boy who fits so entirely inside this narrow bed tonight will not in another handful of years fit inside it at all, and how every one of these ordinary checking-in moments performed so automatically you could do them half asleep yourself is quietly, invisibly running out. You do not dwell on this thought long. You have learned over years of standing in doorways just like this one, that dwelling too long on how quickly it all passes tends to tip tenderness over into something closer to grief. And grief is not what this particular hour, this particular ceremony is built to hold. You draw the door most of the way closed, leaving the gap here stop noticing, and you move on down the hall toward your own room, where your husband is already by the sound of it, most of the way to sleep. The last thing you do, always, before climbing into bed yourself, is stand a moment at your own window, drawing the curtain, checking one final unnecessary check that the street below has gone properly, peacefully dark. It has. The Alsop's porch light still burns small and steady, the one remaining point of gold in an otherwise settled street, and you find looking at it a small unaccountable comfort in the fact that someone else, somewhere close by, is still awake, is still keeping some small light burning against the same dark you've just spent your whole evening quietly managing. You climb into bed beside your husband, who stirs faintly but does not wake, and you lie there a moment in the dark, feeling your own body finally completely stop. No more tasks left undone. No more small vigilances left to perform. The whole house behind you and beneath you, settled into the particular held stillness that will carry it through until morning, when the alarm will sound its small brutal clang and the entire ceremony will begin again. Table set, fire lit, day begun, in an order so familiar you could perform it in your sleep, and very nearly do. You lie there a while longer before sleep properly claims you, running back over the day the way you might run your thumb along a hem to check the stitching held. The porridge this morning, the trip to the grocer, the 39 cents decided in your own favour after all the ironing, the mending, the small ache of Mrs. Whitfield's television, and the larger, quieter comfort that followed it. None of it, taken separately, amounts to very much. A woman's day, described plainly, sounds almost too small to bother recounting. Dishes, shirts, socks, children, walk to bed, and yet you understand, lying here in the particular stillness that only arrives at the very end of a day fully spent, that this smallness is precisely the point, precisely the thing no outside observer could ever properly measure. The value of what you have done today was never meant to be measured from outside. It was only ever meant to be felt from within these walls by the people who slept safely inside them tonight because of it. You think too of the particular way your husband's breathing has already settled into the slow, deep rhythm of proper sleep. Beside you, a rhythm you know as well as you know your own children's, and you feel, listening to it, the tenderness that has survived 11 years of exactly this kind of small, daily unfairness without ever once curdling into something harder. He is not a cruel man. He is not even, by the measure of most men on this street, a particularly thoughtless one. He simply inhabits a version of this marriage that has never once required him to notice what yours requires of you, because no one in his whole life ever asked him to notice the way someone, somewhere far back in your own girlhood, quietly began asking you to notice everything all the time. On behalf of everyone around you, you do not know how to change this. And most nights you have stopped trying to imagine how you might, but you find lying here beside him in the dark that you do not need the unfairness resolved in order to still love him plainly and completely, the way you have loved him since before either of you fully understood what a marriage would actually ask of each of you in return. You think, drifting now towards sleep, of tomorrow's version of this same evening, already waiting, already certain to arrive whether you are ready for it or not. You do not resent its certainty. You have come to understand across 11 years of exactly this rhythm, a peculiar comfort in a life whose shape you can predict this precisely. A comfort that has nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with the deep steadying reassurance of knowing almost to the hour what tomorrow will ask of you, and trusting with the quiet confidence of long practice that you will be equal to it. You close your eyes. Somewhere below, the furnace ticks once, faintly, and goes quiet. The house, at last, is still. There is a particular peace that belongs only to a house that has been properly closed for the night. Not the peace of nothing having happened, but the peace of everything having been in its own quiet way attended to. The table cleared, the fire banked, the children checked and checked again, the boots drying by the stove for tomorrow's short walk to school, the mending folded into the basket for another evening's work, the latch tested, the lamp turned down, the curtain drawn against a street gone dark and settled, and, for tonight at least, entirely at peace. You did not build this peace out of nothing. You built it the way you build most things in this house, out of 100 small ordinary acts, none of them remarkable on their own, each of them repeated so many times across so many years that they have long since stopped feeling like acts at all, and have become instead simply the shape of your evenings, the shape of your days, the shape, if you are honest, of the greater part of your life. There will be another day tomorrow, very much like this one. The alarm will sound. The stove will need lighting. 2 lunches will need packing into 2 metal pails. A collar will need ironing. A grocery decision will need making. 39 cents against liver again. A floor swept that will need sweeping once more by noon. There is no arriving, in a life shaped like this one, at some final destination where the work is finished and the peace simply stays, uncontested, forever. The peace you have built tonight is not a permanent structure. It is closer to something you make fresh each evening, the way you make bread fresh each week, knowing full well it will be eaten, that the making will need doing again and doing it anyway without complaint, because the alternative, a house left uncared for a rhythm left untended, is not a life you would recognize as your own. And yet there is something in this particular kind of peace, hard-won and temporary and entirely unglamorous, that carries its own specific dignity, one that no magazine article and no minister's sermon has ever quite managed to name properly, though you have heard both try. It is the dignity of a woman who has taken an ordinary day unremarkable by any measure the wider world would think to apply to it, and has, through nothing more than her own 2 hands and a rhythm nobody ever wrote down for her, turned it into something whole, something safe, something warm enough that 2 children slept soundly upstairs tonight, without once wondering whether the world outside their window was a kind or an unkind place. You think one last time tonight of the particular word your own mother used to describe evenings like this one, a word she never explained and you never asked her to. She called it simply the settling, as in, the house has finally reached its settling, spoken the way another woman might speak of a pot finally coming properly to the boil. A process with its own natural rhythm that could be hurried only at real cost, and was best in the end, simply allowed to happen in its own good time. You understand that word better tonight than you have on almost any other evening this year, standing at the exact center of your own house's settling, feeling it happen around you and through you. The whole structure of the day easing itself plank by plank and breath by breath into rest. You did not do this for recognition. You would not if pressed to know quite what to do with recognition should it ever arrive. You have gone 11 years without expecting it and have built in its absence. A private satisfaction that answers to no one but yourself, needs no one's witness but your own tired, capable hands. This is perhaps the quiet lesson buried inside a life like this one, inside a kitchen like this one, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in a small Ontario town somewhere in the late 1950s, that peace, real peace, the kind that lets a house settle fully into its own stillness at the end of a long day, is rarely given. It is made, night after night, meal after meal, sock after sock, by someone willing to do the small unglamorous work of making it, whether or not anyone ever thinks to notice that she has. There is a version of this same night happening right now in a house you will never see in a decade, not yet arrived, where a woman very much like you stands at a different kind of counter, in a different kind of quiet, doing some version of this same work in whatever form her own particular era has asked of her. You cannot know her. You cannot know what her kitchen looks like, what her particular anchor object or evening ritual might be, whether her burdens have lightened in ways yours have not, or simply changed shape into forms you would not recognize as burdens at all. but you trust lying here in this settled dark, that whatever her evening looks like, it likely still holds somewhere inside it this same essential shape. A woman making order out of a day's disorder, quietly, without much thanks, because someone in every house, in every era, has always had to be the one who does. You are that someone tonight, as you have been every night for 11 years, as your own mother was before you, as your daughter sleeping soundly just down the hall will very likely come to be herself one day. In some kitchen you cannot yet picture in some version of the same evening ceremony that will feel to her entirely her own, even as it carries forward unknowingly the exact shape of yours. Perhaps, by then, some part of the weight will have shifted. Perhaps not. Either way, you find, lying here in the dark, that you do not begrudge her whatever version of this evening life eventually finds her. You hope, only, that whatever it looks like, it holds for her even a fraction of the quiet satisfaction it has on most nights held for you. There is a particular kind of grace, too, in a life whose worth was never meant to be counted by anyone watching from outside it. You have not built a career the wider world would recognize with a title or a wage of its own. You have not, by any measure, a newspaper with ink to print, achieved very much at all. And yet you understand, lying here in this dark settled house, that the measure a newspaper might apply was never the one that mattered most inside these walls. What mattered was warmth and order and 2 children who trust, without ever needing to question it, that the world into which they wake each morning will be safe and fed and kept. What mattered was a husband who has never once in 11 years come home to a cold stove or an unwashed shirt or a house in any real disarray, and who has, in his own quiet way, built his own peace on the foundation of yours, without ever quite understanding how much foundation laying it required. You think too of all the women you will never meet in kitchens, you will never see across this same country, performing some version of this same evening ceremony tonight, in a farmhouse on the prairies where the wind has nothing to slow it for 100 miles. In a fishing village on the coast where the smell of salt replaces the smell of coal smoke in a mining town further north, where the dark comes earlier and stays later than it does here. You will never know their names. They will never know yours, and yet you are bound together, all of you, by this same unglamorous, unacknowledged essential work. The work of taking an ordinary day and making it through nothing more than patience and habit and love, disguised as labor, into something a family can safely rest inside. There is no dramatic ending to a night like this one. No music swells. No great truth announces itself. There is only a house gone quiet, a family gone safely to sleep, and a woman lying in the dark beside her husband, feeling her own body finally, completely still, after a day that asked everything of her and received it, mostly without complaint. If you have ever wondered what peace looked like before the flicker of a screen filled every quiet hour, before every silence came pre-filled with something to watch or hear or scroll toward, perhaps this is closer to an answer than any history book could offer. Not an absence of noise, but a fullness of attention. Not nothing happening, but everything, quietly, being tended to by careful hands that never once stopped to ask whether the tending was noticed. And perhaps one day, decades from now, in a different kind of house entirely, someone will look back at evenings like this one and wonder how women bore it. The ceaseless small labor, the invisible arithmetic, the silence in place of thanks. Perhaps they will be right to wonder, but perhaps too they will miss something in the wondering that inside all that unacknowledged labor there also lived a genuine and complete kind of love, expressed in 100 small, unglamorous ways because no other language for expressing it had yet been offered. A mended knee, a pressed collar, a story read patiently at bedtime, despite a body already exhausted past its limit. It was not a perfect way to love a family, but it was for you, on this ordinary Tuesday in this ordinary decade, a whole and honest one built with your own 2 hands out of nothing more than habit, patience, and a rhythm nobody ever needed to write down, because you carried it complete inside you the way you had carried so much else quietly for so very long. Sleep now. If sleep is what you came here for, The stove is banked. The children are safe. The street outside has gone dark and still, one porch light glowing faintly gold against the deep blue of a Canadian autumn night, and somewhere behind every other darkened window on this street, another woman very much like you has just finished her own version of this same quiet ceremony, and has just now, like you, allowed herself at last to rest. Thank you for spending these 2 hours here, in this small ordinary kitchen, in this small ordinary life. If this kind of quiet journey into the past is something you'd like more of, consider staying subscribed, and let me know whenever you like what part of ordinary life you'd want to step gently into next. Perhaps a Saturday morning in a prairie farmhouse, or a corner store on a stowy afternoon, or a family's first winter with a television finally glowing in the corner of the room. Good night, sleep well, and thank you truly for being here.